The price of groceries, the cost of everyday essentials, and the strain on family budgets, these are not just numbers on a receipt but real impacts felt in homes across America. The cost of a new car, whether you're buying or leasing, has become a symbol of how global trade decisions ripple through our daily lives. Even your job security, whether you work in a factory, an office, or a small business, hangs in the balance as a Supreme Court battle unfolds over sweeping new tariffs that could reshape the American economy. The court's decision to pause these tariffs has sent shockwaves through the economy and global markets, causing uncertainty for investors and businesses alike. At the heart of the case is a fundamental question: how far can presidential power go in setting trade policy, especially when it affects millions of Americans? The Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce and set tariffs, a responsibility that has shaped U.S. economic policy for generations. But former President Trump, citing a 1977 emergency law, imposed a broad 10% tariff on nearly all U.S. trading partners, arguing it was necessary to protect American industries and jobs. Now, the Supreme Court must decide: did the president overstep his authority, or does the law truly allow such sweeping action without congressional approval? The answer will set a powerful precedent, not just for this administration, but for every future president who seeks to wield economic power on the world stage. Businesses, both large and small, are holding back on investments, delaying hiring, and rethinking their plans as they wait for clarity from the nation's highest court. Meanwhile, consumers are already feeling the pinch of higher prices as companies pass on increased costs, making everyday life more expensive for millions. America's allies and trading partners are watching anxiously, concerned about the future of international agreements and the stability of global commerce. As the legal limbo drags on, supply chains are disrupted, store shelves go unstocked, and diplomatic ties are strained, creating ripple effects far beyond U.S. borders. This is more than a policy dispute. It's a test of the separation of powers, with enormous implications for the economy, foreign policy, and the very structure of American government. The Supreme Court's intervention has paused the tariffs for now, but the underlying conflict between the branches of government is only intensifying, with no easy resolution in sight. The court's final ruling will not only shape the future of U.S. trade and presidential authority, but could also redefine America's role in the global economic order for years to come. The Supreme Court now faces a classic and deeply consequential question, one that has shaped American government for generations. Where does presidential power end, and where does congressional authority begin? This ongoing tension between the executive and legislative branches is at the heart of our constitutional system. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to impose tariffs, ensuring that major economic decisions, especially those affecting trade, are debated and decided by elected representatives, not by a single leader. Over the years, Congress has delegated some trade authority to presidents, but always with strict limits, usually in the name of national security or urgent foreign threats. This case, however, presents a new and unprecedented challenge. President Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, to justify sweeping tariffs on foreign goods. Critics argue this was a constitutional end-run, sidestepping Congress's explicit role in trade policy. Plaintiffs insist that IEPA was never intended for broad trade policy. Instead, it was designed for targeted emergencies, like imposing sanctions on hostile nations or responding to terrorist threats, not for reshaping the entire U.S. trade landscape. The administration counters that chronic trade deficits and the flow of illegal drugs across borders amount to national emergencies, giving the president wide latitude under IEPA to act decisively and protect American interests. Now, the Supreme Court must weigh these arguments and decide: does IEPA truly allow the president to bypass Congress when it comes to imposing tariffs? Or does it set a dangerous precedent for unchecked executive power? The court's answer will not only resolve this case, but also clarify the balance of power between Congress and the president for years, perhaps even decades to come. IEPA, passed in 1977, lets the president regulate economic transactions after declaring a national emergency from foreign threats. Historically, it's been used for targeted sanctions, never for broad tariffs on nearly all trading partners. Trump's use of IEPA for a 10% tariff is unprecedented and controversial. Critics say IEPA was meant to narrow, not expand, presidential power, especially not for general economic policy. The legal fight centers on whether regulating transactions includes imposing tariffs, a power traditionally reserved for Congress. The administration argues that if the president can ban imports, he can also tax them. The Supreme Court's ruling will define IEPA's reach and the future of presidential control over trade. The tariff saga escalated quickly in 2025. Trump imposed targeted tariffs, then a sweeping 10% tariff on all trading partners, citing a national emergency under IEPA. Opponents, states, and businesses sued, and a federal court blocked the tariffs, ruling the president overstepped. The administration appealed, and the tariffs stayed in effect during the legal fight, adding pressure on businesses and consumers. The appeals court showed skepticism, but let the tariffs continue while the case moved forward. Recognizing the stakes, the Supreme Court paused the tariffs and agreed to hear the case. The justice's decision will come in the 2025 to 2026 term, likely before year's end. The outcome will set a landmark precedent for trade and executive power. The nation and the world are watching. While the courts debate, the economy feels the impact. Inflation has accelerated, with consumer prices rising as businesses pass on higher import costs. Job growth has slowed, with hiring down since the tariffs began. Economists debate the causes, but the link to trade turmoil is clear. Uncertainty is chilling investment and hiring. Financial markets have been volatile, reacting to every legal twist. Much of the market's stability hinges on hopes the tariffs will be struck down. The unpredictability makes long-term business planning nearly impossible. Some tariffs, like a steep 50% duty on Brazil, seem arbitrary, adding to the confusion. For businesses relying on imports, sudden policy shifts have created severe challenges. The risk of more politically driven trade disruptions is now a major drag on economic activity. If the court strikes down the tariffs, importers could seek billions in refunds, a major but one-time event for the Treasury. More importantly, it would reaffirm Congress's authority over trade and limit future presidents' use of IEEPA for tariffs. The White House would have to rely on established, more limited trade laws. Internationally, striking down the tariffs would reassure allies and restore predictability to global trade. Stalled negotiations could resume, and supply chains would begin to normalize. For American businesses and consumers, prices would likely ease as import costs fall. Inflationary pressures would subside, boosting consumer power and business confidence. Investment and hiring could rebound as uncertainty lifts. The end of the tariffs would clear a major obstacle to economic growth. If the court upholds the tariffs, presidential power over trade would expand dramatically. Future presidents could declare emergencies for a range of issues and impose tariffs without Congress. This would upend the traditional balance of power and destabilize global trade norms. Allies would face sudden, unpredictable tariffs, likely triggering retaliation and escalating trade wars. U.S. businesses would struggle with permanent uncertainty, making long-term planning and investment risky. Supply chains could be disrupted, and higher costs would become a fixture for producers and consumers. The U.S. would move toward a more protectionist, nationalist economic policy. The president's leverage in international negotiations would grow, but at the cost of stability. The world would have to adapt to a new, more volatile era in global trade. The ongoing legal limbo over the tariffs has sent shockwaves through global markets, leaving investors and policymakers alike on edge. The uncertainty has not only rattled stock exchanges, but also strained diplomatic ties between major economies. Financial markets have swung wildly with each new legal development as investors anxiously await the Supreme Court's decision, knowing it could reshape the global economic landscape. America's closest allies, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, find themselves caught in a difficult position, forced to choose between negotiating for exemptions and bracing for the possibility of more tariffs. The U.S. quote, S unilateral action has replaced years of cooperation with a growing sense of mistrust, and foreign leaders are now watching the U.S. courts as closely as American businesses, hoping for a sign of stability. China, a main target of the tariffs, sees the case as a crucial signal of future U.S. policy direction, further complicating already tense trade talks and making compromise even more elusive. Multinational corporations now face a strategic nightmare. Should they absorb the rising costs, pass them on to consumers, or completely overhaul their supply chains to adapt to the new reality? The lack of clear rules and guidance has paralyzed decision-making at the highest levels and slowed global investment as companies hesitate to commit resources amid so much uncertainty. The Supreme Court's ruling will determine whether the U.S. remains committed to a predictable, rules-based order, or pivots to a more unpredictable approach. The world is watching and waiting for clarity from Washington. The stakes for global trade, investment, and diplomacy could not be higher, as the outcome will shape international relations for years to come. We stand at a crossroads. A single Supreme Court decision will shape the future of American trade and global order. The case is about more than a 10% tariff. It's about the limits of presidential power and the role of Congress. The outcome will set a precedent for decades, affecting everything from consumer prices to international alliances. Striking down the tariffs would restore balance and predictability. Upholding them would expand executive power and risk global volatility. The Supreme Court isn't just interpreting a law, it's charting the course for U.S. economic leadership. As the world waits, the decision will spark a national conversation about America's role in the global economy. The answer will define the nation's economic identity for years to come. The stakes have never been higher.